Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. So, in this episode, we have with us David Perell. And David Perell is one of my writing idols. And thank you so much, Dave, for taking the time to do this. He has done a lot of stuff in writing. He has his Rite of Passage, which is a course that teaches a lot of students how to write better. He's the host of the North Star podcast, where he hosts brilliant educators, learners, and has a strong community which is driven by the passion for their own creative expressions. And his essays are some of the most fantastic ones. Some of the ones that really struck me were, the coolest things I learned in 2019, the annual review 2019, Learn Like an Athlete, and The Never Ending Now. And he's also, as I said, the creator of the writing course Rite of Passage. And yeah, I guess that is pretty much it. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to come today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So I guess in this episode, I'm not going to ask you, or at least I'll try not to ask you a lot of the basic questions. I'm assuming that the listeners who would be listening to this particular episode already know a lot about you. So I guess I'll dive right in and straight away get to the point about how I got introduced to you, and then ask you a few questions, some of which I've already talked about briefly, in terms of consuming content, producing content, writing and thinking, and just in the end about some life advice and skill sets. So, in terms of how I got introduced to you, so that's really an interesting story. I met a software engineer at Uber, and her name is Shravanti,
Yeah,
and she actually told me, "Oh, you know her?"
her boyfriend's one of my best friends.
Oh wow, that's super cool. And she told me about, just getting onto Twitter, and she introduced me to you. So then I read these a few of your essays and went through your tweets. That just got me super duper excited because for the first time I had witnessed like pure originality and just a form of genuine voice, something that I had not witnessed earlier in terms of, my other search for self-improvement and other kinds of advice. And then I recently also interacted with Salman Ansari, with
One of my
whom you also had a
students.
video. Yeah, exactly. So I found that there's this community of learners that I guess, more or less is ranging in the same area. So that's why I thought it'd be great to reach out and do this podcast. So diving right in, my first question is about consuming content. And I know that Twitter is one of the, platforms that you use very often, and you're very bullish on Twitter. Given that we live in an age of sort of content abundance and limited time, how do you pick and choose books, articles, podcasts, and how do you essentially consume so much content?
Yeah, I actually don't consume as much as you think, but I also consume a lot. So part of it is it's my whole job to consume content. That was always my goal. So when I was in college, I remember reading certain people like Alex Danko and Ben Thompson and Kevin Simler. And I remember saying, the way that these people think is how I want to think. And I enjoyed consuming content so much because what I found was when you could learn on the internet, you could dive so much deeper into ideas. And by learning from generally specific individuals instead of publications, you were getting a much more raw and unfiltered perspective into the world, and that was really interesting to me. So I guess the first thing I would say is, yeah, it's my job to consume content, but in terms of then how I do consume a lot and actually managing information abundance, I think that there's way too much emphasis placed on how to choose what you consume, and there's not enough emphasis placed on the filters that you have. And what you want to do is basically climb up the funnel so that the things that get filtered to you are of very high quality. And that's where I would begin this process. I'm pretty ruthless about making sure that from the things I'm consuming, there are at least recommended sources from different places. So I guess I could give you a couple buckets here. So the first you could just say is email newsletters. I subscribe to a great newsletter called The Browser.
Browser.
I read Tyler Cowen's blog Marginal Revolution. I subscribe to a number of creators and I just look for little signals. So it's so in the flow of things that I almost can't even remember. But like, I'm just looking for things that resonate a little bit more from places that are generally obscure. So, for example, I found one today from a newsletter from Justin Murphy, who's a writer who's exploring sort of indie writers and creators on the internet. And he was recommended a newsletter about an article about Max Weber, who sociologist in the earliest 20th century. And I'd been studying Weber and I saw, okay, this looks interesting. I had been studying Weber by auditing a class at Columbia, and therefore the synthesis of the two from a person who I trust. I've now basically gone through so much filtering there that now when I sit down to read that article, I know that it's going to be of high quality. But then what I do is I never come across an article and read it right away. And this is pretty important. I always save it to Instapaper or I save it to Pocket. And that way, what ends up happening is when I actually sit down to read, which isn't a lot of time, maybe an hour a day, what ends up happening is all the articles, all the books, they have to compete for my attention. And then I just read what I feel like reading.
Okay, so I guess at that time you're so in the moment that it's the decision that you make is sort of intuitive. It's not based on certain predefined filters that, if this article is from X friend in Y magazine, only then would I read it.
Yeah, very intuitive. I'm extremely intuitive about most things. I do set up rules and systems on the back end because they really help other people, but I very rarely set up a system beforehand. So what I do is I just follow, and this has to do with how I think about business opportunities. It has to do with how I think about writing. It has to do with how I think about information consumption. I'm very intuitive, and then I look back on things in retrospect and I say, okay, what am I actually doing here? What is the 90% that I can put into a series of systems? And then begin to share that with other people.
Got it. And that's how you sort of, produce content also. Like once you've consumed it, you begin sharing, and that also helps you internalize the content better and also share it with the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me, it's just like, what am I excited about? So if I sit down and I have an epiphany, okay, just send that tweet. On Wednesday, I try to move pretty fast. So on Wednesday, I had an idea because I'd been talking to different college students, and I'd actually be curious on your take here is
Don't go
so
back to college in the fall, I
exactly,
think.
don't go back to college.
Yeah.
So I put that out on Twitter. It obviously struck a chord, and I'm just looking for things that resonate. So things that are charged in the right way. I don't like charged things that are politically charged and stuff like that. That doesn't really interest me. But things that are interesting ideas. It's very hard to know which of your ideas are interesting and which ones aren't. So I just throw out a lot of tweets, probably 30, 35 tweets a week. And then I'm just paying attention, okay, what's resonating. And then, so I published that tweet on Wednesday. 21 hours later, I had a article published. And so then 12 hours after the article was published, I got in touch. Somebody through the Chan Zuckerberg Institute introduced me to somebody at the Harvard School of Education. And that's just 48 hours from idea to introduction. And I think that really gets into how I think about writing, where a lot of people think about writing as an end in itself. Okay, we're going to learn grammar, we're going to learn sentence structure, we're going to learn paragraphs. And that's just not very interesting to me, first of all. And second of all, a lot of that stuff's actually getting automated. So you can use Hemingway, you can use Grammarly, and it takes care of these things for you. And like, my spelling is terrible. And then what ends up happening, the reason why writing is interesting to me and the way that I think about writing fundamentally differently from other people is that writing is just a way to create opportunities and a way to meet people in the same way that for you, that's what podcasting is.
Got it. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for how you consume content and sort of structure it in your own mind and intuitively approach different pieces of information, especially during this age. My second question was about more on the side of producing content, and at the same time of which you consume so much, how is it possible, or what frameworks do you use in order to condense the information in 240 characters as well as write long form articles?
Yeah, I mean, they're very different. So, when it comes to Twitter, the way that I think about things is how can I provide as much information and as much novelty or interestingness in a very short number of characters. So, I think that my style on Twitter is like, here is an entire semester of what you would learn as your bullet points in a writing syllabus. Okay, that's just one tweet. And so somebody will read that, and I have what I call the screenshot test. And the screenshot test is I like writing tweets that make somebody say, "Oh my goodness, that's really insightful. I need to screenshot that so I can save it for the future." And so
Okay.
I have quite a high bar for Twitter. And I think that one of the things that people get wrong is people think of Twitter as such a menial platform where it's like, oh, it's just a tweet. It doesn't really matter. But Twitter's also the most important media company in the world. Like, it is
Why?
where the influencers are influenced. If you're the president of the United States, if you're a major journalist, if you're the CEO of a company like Stripe, like Shopify, like Twitter itself, all those people are on Twitter. And so everybody's thinking of Twitter as like, oh, it's just this little business. No, Twitter is where the world leaders get their information. And so rather than taking Twitter as the least serious, we should take Twitter extremely seriously, knowing that those people can actually read our stuff if we have a really good tweet. So that's what I would say first. Don't think about going viral. Don't think about much except, will this make, if I saw this tweet, would it make my feed way better? And if that's the case, then tweet it. Like, all you're trying to do is like improve the experience for other people, help them learn faster, give them a laugh, give them a surprise. If you are taking responsibility for actually making the feed of your users who are smart, who are busy, who are curious, who have a high bar for information quality, if you can take that really seriously and you can say everything I publish is going to be of ultra high quality, then you're going to begin to attract an audience that really appreciates that.
Got it. And in terms of long form writing, I was wondering about your research process, and again, what sort of frameworks do you use in order to sort of write those long form articles that you've already written?
Yeah, so I think that I would start by saying school teaches us to research first and write second. I write first and research second. So I don't do much research at all for those essays, but there's a lot of research in it. So, how does that make sense? Let me explain it. So, one of the biggest issues with the way that we're taught to write is nobody has a note taking system. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous that you would go through college and you would learn all these things. And I don't know where my notes are from college. I guess I learned all these things. I don't know what I learned in media history because the semester ends and you just throw away your notes. You do the same things with your essay. You just, sophomore year is over, let's throw them away. Okay, our master's program is over, let's throw them away. It's ridiculous. And so what you should be doing is aggregating a really good knowledge management system day by day, week by week, month by month. And what you find is you write long form essays once you just have enough information already compiled to just write the essay. So, like, I probably wrote one of, if not the go to essay on Peter Thiel's philosophy and framework for life.
Yes.
By the time I wrote that, I'd already read 0 to 1, his core book. I'd already had a book club on it. I'd already read many of his essays. I'd already read much analysis of his. I'd already rewatched all of his lectures from Stanford University, the class that he gave. And then I began to see, I'd already studied Rene Girard, who influenced Thiel, and I just began to see, oh, I already learned something from just having fun. Now I know exactly what to write about. And I think that the problem is when you don't have a note taking system, you have to go back and do all that research over and over. And so I basically have this ridiculous superpower, which is because my note taking system is so good, and I teach this in Write a Passage, the exact one I use, because my note taking system is so good, I can look like I'm spending all this time reading. I can look like I'm spending all this time consuming. But as I told you at the beginning of the podcast, I mean, I spend a lot of time consuming, but not nearly as much as you think. And I'm a very slow reader. So I just do research just to fill in some gaps at the end. But you could almost think of it like bricks and mortar. Like, I already have the bricks. I just need to do a little research to have the mortar so all the bricks stick together.
Got it. So like each time you read an article, which could be just out of interest or, for any long form article in the future, do you always take notes right after you've read that article?
I take notes while I read the article. So what I do is I save everything into Instapaper, and then I highlight all the important parts, and then I do the same thing in Kindle. So like if I find something that resonates, and once again, it's a very intuitive process, then I'll just write a note in Instapaper or in Kindle, and I'll say, this is what I'm thinking. So very often what I'll do is I'll even start producing as I'm consuming. So say I read something like colleges, 27% of colleges say that they are in a financially difficult spot for the fall semester. Then I'll say, oh, due to, like, I will write this in my note. I will say, oh, this just sparked an idea. Due to the macro environment situation right now, if students don't go back for the fall, if 27% are already in a position of financial stress, at least 5% of them will go out of business. Then what I'll say is I'll keep reading, and as I read an article, I'm now thinking about this idea of these colleges might go out of business. They are going to need students. They're in a really tough economic place. I could literally finish an article and just by my notes as I read have everything I need for an article. So the thing is, I think of production and consumption as almost two of the same things. Like when I consume things, I'm always thinking of what am I going to produce because I just care about production. Whereas the way that most people think about this stuff is like, I mean, it baffles me, right? Like your attention is so scarce. Why would you ever spend all these hours reading a book, then never have a conversation with somebody about that book, so then you forget it? I try to do a book club for the vast majority of books I read. Then not even take notes on the book. So then by the time you have to go do research, you have to go back and read the thing. And then when you're reading those things, you're just consuming again, and your research process is very slow and very manual. And then you finish the essay and you throw away the notes. Every single chain of that system, which is exactly how we're taught to do things, is wrong. Every single one. And so the thing is if
true.
you could actually flip these things, it's not that hard. It's just that we're thinking of writing in a pre-internet, pre-digital, pre-information abundance paradigm.
I see your point over there, but I think my question also, like as a follow-up question, comes to the point that if you say that production and consumption are two sides of the same coin, and you think of them as interlinked, and you start producing as you're consuming, I worry if it's possible for, say, the writer to engage at a very deep level with the content that they're producing, and not at a shallow level, which just picks random snippets or facts or ideas and summarizes them and repackages them and then delivers. And the reason I ask this question is because I find myself also in the same field in the sense that I try to produce as I consume, because otherwise I don't see, it doesn't feel productive to me. But I also at times think to myself whether I'm just repackaging and re-summarizing the content and not producing anything new. So
Yeah,
how do you sort of navigate that?
yeah, it's a great question. Great question. Well, okay, let me just take, there's two questions in there. So the first thing is, you don't always have to produce as you consume, and I just gave you a very intense example of what this looks like. At the very least, you should be reading digitally and saving your highlights. Like, just at the very least base level, right? Because there's actually times where it's really nice to just consume stuff and you can just sort of sit back and just chill. Like, I get it, right? You don't always need to do this. But to get to your second question about, are you just repackaging insights? Well, the way that ideas work generally is, I would say there's two kinds of ideas. So the first is, it's fine to repackage ideas. Like, if you can actually summarize somebody else's ideas, say that you read an 80,000 page book and you need to write a 6,000 page essay on it, you have now, like my partner did this, Tiago, my business partner. He runs a course called Building a Second Brain, and he is
Yes.
an excellent summarizer. So he summarized a book called How to Take Smart Notes and wrote like a 6,000 word summary on it that for many people is actually better than the book. Like, he is adding stuff to it. And when you do that kind of summary, that's when you really understand a book. Like, information is like food. You can't just put food through your mouth and get nutrients. You have to actually digest information. And in food, we digest in our stomach, and our stomach needs to process that. With information, we need to play with it like, like Play-Doh. We need to actually grapple with it, see how things stretch, see how things contract, see how things move when we combine them in new ways. And we take these existing ideas, we flip them a couple times, just like a Rubik's Cube, and then we have the same basic format, but a whole new set of colors on the Rubik's Cube. And we're now seeing the same thing through a new lens. So let me just say that, questioning the premise of what you're saying, you don't need to be original in anything. And like, that process of deep digestion through summary really helps you learn things. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there's an idea in complexity science called emergence. And what emergence is that the sum is greater than its parts. And
Just told.
you end up getting into these things that are called phase transitions. So if you take something like water going into ice, you have the exact same general molecules, and then as they go from 35 degrees to 34 to 33 to 32 to 31 to 30, right at around 32 degrees, that water becomes ice. And so what you have is a fundamentally the same basic elements, but now they're displaying themselves in a different format. And my point in saying this is, once you do a really good summary, you begin to see opportunities for your own intellectual phase transitions, where you're building off of other people, of course, but as you actually engage with ideas and they begin to turn in your brain, you begin to see them with this tremendous depth, and then you can apply them to new fields. So let me give you an example. Ideas, what they do is they start in one place, and then they work their way up to other places, often over hundreds of years. So if you start with the Bible, the first and the 10th commandments are about not copying others and not idolizing false gods. Don't covet your neighbor's goods. And what you see is those two are arguably the two most important commandments. And even going back to the Cain and Abel story, that is a story of rivalry. It's a story of conflict. And a lot of stories and myths throughout human history, they go back to twins and siblings and how much conflict and tension there is among people who are kind of the same. And then you have Rene Girard, who comes out and he says that we get into conflict not because we're different, but because we're the same, right? Like you see this in Romeo and Juliet. At the very beginning of the play, it is two houses, both alike in dignity, meaning the two homes of Romeo and Juliet, they are the same. And how does the play end? With tremendous tragedy, tremendous conflict, right? So we fight with people not who are the same, but who are different. And that is one of the fundamental tenets of mimetic theory. And then what you have is Peter Thiel. When he goes and he starts PayPal, he doesn't want any mimetic conflict in PayPal. So what does he do? He has every single person be responsible for one thing and one thing only. And that's to reduce mimetic conflict. That's to reduce the Cain and Abel syndrome. That's to reduce and to go against the warnings of the first and the 10th commandments. And so what you see is even in the company structure of PayPal, it goes back to the Bible. And you can actually trace the lineage of that idea. And you can say, oh, that's interesting. And it gets back into Rubik's Cubes, it gets back into emergence, and it gets back into all the themes that I've been discussing.
Wow. I think that was definitely a really full answer. I think I'll have to rewatch this entire segment just to sort of truly internalize what you've said, because I know that there is a lot of depth over there. And the way you have summarized and the way you have said that as a first step, summarizing ideas is okay, because as you continue doing that over a period of time and you continue engaging with them, even though at a quote unquote shallow level, because you're producing and consuming at the same time, eventually you would be able to notice this pattern, and obviously supplemented by a good note-taking system, you would be able to notice this pattern, basis which you can stand on the shoulders of giants and produce something that is incredibly valuable and something that did not exist before. But the step to reach that is definitely is preceded by all of these steps in which you have to first produce and consume at the same time. I think that definitely makes a lot of sense to me and does clarify my reservation about producing and consuming at the same time.
The whole idea of originality is just, it's kind of crazy, and I think there's a lot of pressure that we get in school. Like, what's the worst thing that you can do in school English class? Plagiarize, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, the holy grail of plagiarism, right? It's like,
Yes.
what's gonna happen?
Yes.
Something's gonna happen if you plagiarize. You could get kicked out of school. You're gonna lose. It's the worst thing you could ever do. And so what ends up happening is that we're running away from like the grim reaper of plagiarism. That's the word I was looking for. The grim reaper of plagiarism. I like that term. And so what ends up happening is the grim reaper is chasing us, and we're just like, this is the worst thing. So then we don't go anywhere close to it. And then what ends up happening is, because we're so obsessed with being original, we don't actually build on top of everyone's ideas. And it's just not the way that things work at all. I mean, I've spent a lot of time studying different people and studying different writers, and like, go look at the bibliography for a book from Nassim Taleb. It is like 15 pages in 8-point font of all the books that he's cited. And then, one of my favorite things to do with people is, say that you find someone that you really liked. You asked about information consumption at the beginning. Best way to find book recommendations: find one person that you like and read all their favorite books. And so I did this, for example, with Tiago Forte. So when I found Tiago, like, his Building a Second Brain course changed my life so deeply. And I just said, this guy is a literal genius. And then I started reading all of his favorite books, like Principles of Product Development Flow, Breaking Smart. And then I was like, oh, wait. Yeah, Tiago's really smart, but he just got all these other people's ideas and then Rubik's cubed them and then turned them into a fundamentally new output. And I've done this with so many different people. And what you just realize is that ideas aren't original, and there's a very wide canyon, very wide, and school just brushes over this with no nuance, between plagiarism, which is obviously awful, and borrowing other people's ideas to build off of them with due credit, which is like what the intellectual project of humanity is.
I think that's wonderfully put. I think that's wonderfully put. I guess moving on, because I know that you're short on time. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about skill sets and skills. I read your tweet a few days ago in which you said, learn to code, write, sell, and what was the fourth thing? Code, write, sell, and
Speak.
speak. Yeah, and you're set for life. I was just wondering more about two things. One, it seems to me from your writing and tweets and in general that you value writing much more than any other skill, be it, at the senior levels of any company, everyone is a corporate writer. And every remote worker is a writer, and so on and so forth. And you've extrapolated it to a lot of fields. So the first question is whether you think that viewing things in general in life from the prism of writing is a safe or a useful lens. And the context I ask this question is in the aphorism of, when you have only one hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, it seems to me as if non-quantitative skills like writing, and I may be wrong even on the premise of saying that, like in general, being in the tech ecosystem of Silicon Valley, are not as valued or marketable by other people as quote unquote quantitative skills like coding, math, and like those kinds of things in general. So I wonder what your thoughts are on these two particular scenarios.
Yeah. So let's put it this way. I mean, if I were to add a fifth to that, I would say what I could teach my kids, which was really the context of this, I would say
Yes.
learn to code so that you can talk to computers, then learn to write, learn to speak, and learn design so that you can talk to humans, and learn to sell so that you can make money. That's
Yeah.
how I would think about this. And when it comes to writing and having the hammer and the nail, I don't think I'm saying at all that the other skills aren't valued, but I do think that there's something fundamental about writing which then helps you think better for all the other skills. So let's just take those five skills: design, code, selling, speaking, and writing. So
Yeah.
I I think of writing underneath the other ones because if you can write well about something, writing a isn't only the skill of writing. It is the skill of thinking. It is the skill of taking the world and organizing it in such a way that it's manageable and that what used to be abstract becomes clear.
Yeah.
And when you can write, you can actually take like the Constitution. You can have something that stands the test of time without entropy, really, that then now 350 million Americans, or whatever it is, can actually treat that document as something that is of importance, of value, and we place that document above any individual person. The rule of law in America, at least in theory, stands above any individual person. Over the course of human history, that's a major achievement, right? Many feudal systems, for example, it was what the king said was the rule of law. And you see that in many parts of the world. That's part of what makes America attractive to people, provided that that's true. And my point in saying this is that once you can actually write well about a topic, which is basically synonymous with thinking well, you can't like write well about something without thinking well about it. Well, then it actually becomes easier to speak. So if I talk about writing, the reason I can talk about writing better than I can talk about most other subjects is I've already worked out these ideas on paper. Like when I sit down to write for 90 minutes a day, I'm actually thinking for 90 minutes a day. But thinking, there's a famous Rodin statue that's at Columbia University. It's also very famous. You'll see it everywhere. It's called The Thinker. And it is
Just thinking like
the
this. Yeah.
statue is thinking, and
Yeah.
the right knuckle is pointed at the bottom of the chin as as the statue is hunched over. And that's how we think about thinking. And I just beg to differ. I think that you think about thinking by writing. And so what you do when you write is you write and rewrite. But really what you're doing is you're thinking and rethinking. And what's great about writing is all your ideas are there, and so then you can rethink through them. So then what happens is now, when you start selling, well, you've already written out the arguments that you're going to make, both emotionals or pathos, ethos, and logos, to use the Greek system of this. You've already put that out there and said, this is how I'm going to sell the product, and you've done it in writing, so it's way easier. Then when you go to code, you've already thought through, okay, what are the parameters for this, and how, as an individual or as a team, how are we thinking about this product, this piece of software that we're building? When you go to design, you're already thinking, maybe this is more symbiotic with design, but you can communicate an idea with writing and by design. But also, like, for any design project, you want to write out a scope and stuff like that. And then very clearly for speaking, like what you're doing when you're speaking eloquently is you're re-saying some of the things that you've already written. So when I interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson, arguably the most famous astrophysicist in the world, he told me that he almost never says anything in public that he hasn't written down before. And I don't do that, but I took that to heart, in that the reason that he's so famous is because he's so eloquent. And the reason he's so eloquent is because he is speaking what he's already written.
Got it. Got it. I think that really answers that. The hammer nail analogy is probably not the perfect one, because there are these host of other skills that also surround writing, and writing is sort of like the bedrock of all these skills, which allows you to do better in speaking, in writing that design doc, and essentially just being an eloquent speaker. As for the second part of the question about the quantitative and non-quantitative, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, do you want to just reframe the question? I want to make sure that I answer it properly.
Yes, I was wondering, do you feel that non-quantitative skills like writing are actually more or equally valuable as quantitative ones like coding? Because in Silicon Valley, coding is, I mean, in the marketplace, valued more than, say, writing.
Yeah, so actually there was a really interesting study that came out that said that what you see with coding, and this is just one study, it was from the New York Times, so it's a fairly credible publication, but do take it with a grain of salt. But it looks like the plateau on pure coding is actually, like, what ends up happening is you make a very high salary early in your career, but then it begins to siphon off later on. So say that you're graduating college and you want to get a good first paying job, something that's respected enough, something that makes $200,000 a year. Yeah, you want to probably go study math and statistics, machine learning, and coding. Like, absolutely, that's a great place to be. And I don't want to say that any of these skills are like better or worse than
Yeah,
others. Like, I would never be able to do those things. Like, it's just not how my brain works. Like, for me, I'm best when I can go be creative and stuff like that. And but then what happens is later in your career, you're not coding. Like Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe, isn't coding. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, isn't coding. When Mark Andreessen IPO'd Netscape, he wasn't coding. And all of them benefit from knowing how to code. Don't get me wrong. I actually think it's part and
yeah,
parcel for the job. But what you see is that to like just be banging your fingers on the keyboard broadly, I think has a smaller upside than writing itself. But there's plenty exceptions to this, and knowing how to do both is really what's great. But Mark Zuckerberg spends a lot more time typing words for prose than he does typing letters for code.
Got it.
But like,
I
we
think
don't
that
all
makes
need
sense.
to be Mark Zuckerberg. Like, my point is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they're both super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the last question before we sort of wrap up real quick. Um, what is a skill or habit that you wish you would have started earlier, knowing that, looking back at life, you think would have benefited you in terms of writing, lifestyle, or just general on your learning journey?
Workout. Get in
Workout.
unbelievable shape. Seriously, get in unbelievable shape.
Why do you say that?
Because it's your body. Like, I think that if I have one criticism of Silicon Valley culture, is it places the mind way above the body, and I'm much more interested in a symbiosis between mind and body. And like, it's your body. You only have one of them, and your body is what lets you go out and do things. And the more I study longevity, the more I study health. I mean, even something as simple as coronavirus, look at how much better off people who didn't have respiratory conditions, who weren't obese, look at how much better off they did. And there's something very weird in society where we've normalized obesity, but we
Yeah,
have 71% of Americans over 20 who are overweight. We have 19% of Americans, like 2 through 19, are obese. It's something crazy like that. We have a country that has normalized being out of shape, that has normalized eating junk and processed food, and it's awful. I mean, my favorite room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art is the Greek statues. And these bodies for the men are like, they're just absolutely beautiful, with these chiseled arms and just in
that's right.
amazing shape. And if we go back to Greek literature, the Greeks gave us a lot of the intellectual capital of what our modern society is founded on. They gave us Plato, they gave us Aristotle, they gave us Socrates, they gave us the modern conceptions of how governments are run. And it's probably not a coincidence that they also gave us the Olympics. And getting in shape, the same things that you need to get in shape, of diligence, of showing up when you don't feel like it, of, okay, how do I do this, how do I hold myself accountable when nobody else will. Nobody else in life is going to care more about your own success than you. Like, it is your job to do that. And when it comes to building the habit, but also when it comes to just living a rich life, you want to have an incredible body, in terms of not just the aesthetics of it, which is how most people hear that, but a
Yeah,
body that allows you to, hey, let's go for a hike. Yeah, I'm in. Hey, I need to sit down and write for 2 hours without getting distracted and to think at a very high level. Yeah, let's do it.
got
And
it.
being in really good shape pays incredible dividends, and working out is the single most important habit I've ever built.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. All of these questions were definitely very well answered, and they've essentially cleared up a lot of things for me personally.
Great.
Most of these questions would personally help me, especially working out, because I've been big into it of late. And I guess I just have to rewatch this entire podcast and this video just to sort of internalize all the references and all the advice that you've shared. And I'm pretty sure that it has to be helpful for all of the people who are also on the same journey as you on learning better and just being a better version of themselves. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dave, for taking time to do this.
Yeah, thank you. You you are incredibly diligent, and I saw it in the emails that you sent, and just the questions that you asked. You have an amazing future ahead of you, and let me know how I can help.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you. Bye.